Major funding for Through Deaf Eyes is provided by
This program has been made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding for more than 30 years of who we were, who we are, and who we will be.
the Annenberg Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
I was driving down on the freeway. Oh, it was a beautiful day. All the birds were flying, and all the birds were thinking, and all the birds dropping. Hey, you! I got you there. All of a sudden, I looked at the rearview mirror. The guy behind me was so angry. Hey, you! What are you, deaf, huh? Oh. Wow, that makes me angry. Of course, I'm deaf and proud. When I step on the gas. Oh, by the way, I have a Mercedes 500 SEL. I'm wishing them. Thank you very much. Finally, I caught up with that car. Automatic window. Hey, you! What are you hearing, huh? Oh. Yeah.
When you talk to people who can hear, and you ask them, what do you think it would be like to be a deaf person? Then all if they're thinking is, well, I couldn't do this, can't. They would start listing all the things they can't do. And I don't think like that. Deaf people don't think like that. We think about what we can do.
We sign, we make movies, we do stage performances, we can write books. But we make ourselves understood.
Say the word airplane. Airplane.
Let's take a quiz. Ready? True or false? All deaf people use sign language. Sign language is universal. Deaf people live in a silent world. Having a deaf child is a tragedy. All deaf people would like to be cured. Hint: the answers are all going to be false.
There was a little girl, a neighbor girl, that came over and played with me, and we used gesture with each other. One time I went over to visit her, and I saw her using her lips to communicate with her mother. They weren't using their hands at all. And so I ran home and I asked my mother what was happening. Why aren't they using their hands? My mother said, they're hearing. And I said, oh, well, what are we? She said, Daddy and I are deaf. You're deaf, your brothers are deaf. And I said, is everyone deaf? Is that little girl the only hearing girl in the world? She said, no, everyone else is like them. And I said, oh, now I get it.
Deafness is almost always one generation thick. Over 90% of all deaf people have parents who can hear. And most deaf parents have children who can hear. So deaf people interact on a meaningful and intimate level with hearing people all their lives. Yet most Americans have very little understanding of what it means to be deaf.
I was doing an interview once with CNN, and a woman and I were getting ready, getting our makeup ready, and I mean, it was just live, in front of millions of people. I was ready to be interviewed, and everybody was in their positions, and with 3 seconds before the light was to come on the camera, the interviewer needed my attention, and she said, Marley, my dog is deaf, like you. And the next thing I know, the light is on the camera, and there I am live, and I'm thinking in the back of my head, does she want to throw me a bone? Does she want me to identify with her dog? I had no idea what the significance of that was.
People need to realize that we're normal. Don't just look at my ear. Don't look at it as a physical handicap. We're normal, really. Yes, we do have some accommodations to be made to survive in a society where it's dominated by hearing people. But at the same time, if you were to come into the room and it would be full of deaf people, then you would need the accommodation too.
35 million Americans are hard of hearing to some degree. Of these, an estimated 300,000 people are profoundly deaf. Deaf people can be found in every ethnic group, every region, every economic class. Some deafness is hereditary. Some is caused by illness or accident. To be deaf is to be part of a tiny minority in a hearing world. But it is far from the uniform and tragic experience that most hearing people imagine.
Being deaf is, it's part of me, something I have to deal with, but it doesn't keep me from being happy. It doesn't make me either happy or sad. It's just like being a man instead of a woman, or being tall instead of short.
Maybe a person can't see, and is that normal? Maybe it is, and maybe a person walks with a bit of a limp. Perhaps that's normal to one person and not to another. What about left-handedness? Is that abnormal or is that normal?
We have 2 children. We have Bradford here, who's probably the only kid in town who can talk on the phone and play basketball at the same time. He is our only hearing child. He has to sign all the time because there's no one else in the family who is hearing.
Our daughter's 11. She's deaf. We have just the 2, and we don't want any more. We have a boy and a girl, and that's enough for us. I guess we're the all-American family. Just the 4 of us. It's a nice number.
Today, it's entirely possible for a deaf family to call itself an all-American family. But that isn't how the story begins. For centuries, hearing people saw deafness as a horrendous misfortune. When a Protestant revival swept through 19th century America, fervent Christians labored to bring the gospel to unbelievers. But one group of souls seemed locked away forever from the Word of God.
Most of the deaf people in America in the early 1800s lived in rural areas. They were separated from each other. They were isolated. Most had very little communication with the people around them. Deaf people had a limited understanding of what they could do, of their own possibilities, and people with deaf children really had no idea what their children could achieve.
Very few Americans believed that deaf people could be educated at all. Until 1817, when a Connecticut clergyman named Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet discovered his mission in life: to bring the gospel to people who could not hear. In Hartford, he opened the first permanent school for deaf children in America, with just 7 students, and a head teacher from France, who is now a legend in the deaf community.
Laurent Clerc was a teacher at the Paris Institution for the Deaf, and he was an extremely well-educated, sharp, witty man who was very, very deaf, and had been very, very deaf since infancy. One of the things that Clerc brought to the United States was French Sign Language.
Laurent Clerc taught using his hands. He communicated with sign. To Gallaudet, the language was a revelation. He called it highly poetical. To Clerc and to many deaf people, signing was natural and practical.
Clerc discovered that there were already some signs in use by some of his students. Clerc took his native French Sign Language and he blended it with a little bit of the signs that he saw students using here in the United States.
The result was an American Sign Language that spread west and south as new schools for deaf children opened. New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed a law founding the first college in the world for deaf students. Eventually, it would be called Gallaudet University. And all these schools used sign.
My dear sir, the organs of speech are in no way affected by deafness. The deaf person is mute simply because he cannot hear and hasn't been taught to speak.
A contradiction in terms, sir. A most illogical contradiction. The deaf-mute speech organs may be intact, agreed.
In April 1871, a bright young Scottish immigrant, Alexander Graham Bell, began teaching deaf children in Boston. Like Gallaudet, he had a passion and a mission to bring language to deaf people.
Nature inflicted upon the deaf child but one flaw. One little flaw, imperfect hearing. But we deny him speech by not teaching him to speak.
Society in general views Alexander Graham Bell as an American hero, as the inventor of the telephone. He was famous, wealthy, and influential. His wife was deaf. His own mother was deaf. He was always associating with the deaf community. He was a teacher of deaf children at a day school in Boston. He was very familiar with the deaf world.
Alexander Graham Bell is a very important figure in deaf folklore. He offers an antagonist perspective because he's like the boogeyman. And even though he's a great man in his own right, he did put forth the idea that a life without signing would be a better life.
Bell thought that signing prevented deaf people from learning to speak, so he was against deaf people using sign, their natural language. Bell believed that sign language marked them as different and kept them in the lower classes. He believed that earlier in the 1800s, sign language had been their only recourse. But now, there's a better choice, the technology to teach them to speak and lip read. The oral method.
Bell thought over 100 years ago that if every deaf child received the right type of education and the use of the right technology, that those children could learn to use spoken language.
Oral schools for deaf children opened in the late 1860s. They did not teach sign, and in fact, outlawed its use. Instead, they began speech training, teaching deaf children to generate sounds, to mimic the mouth shapes and breathing patterns of speech. And if children knew what speech looked like, the oralists thought, they could learn to read lips. This was an idea that divided educators of deaf children, and it still does today. Here's one man's take on lip reading from Autism by deaf filmmaker Renee Visco.
How do you lip read? That's a very dangerous question, because if you say yes, I'm well, wait a minute, no, I have to go slower. Then, no, just tap normally.
He was like, it's been hectic and we haven't had a lot of time to prepare, but it's a take-home. But I mean, we had all this homework and quizzes and stuff, so I just lucked out.
Did you take a look at it?
I have it with me.
I can understand people who speak directly to me in good light without too much background noise. And a lot of what I do in speaking is arranging these circumstances